Okay, so at this point we have our front end set up to start interacting with our server. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add all of the network logic and network requests to our front end that we need. Now the main point of interest here is going to be that whenever we make a request from our front end, we're going to need to include a little bit of extra data beyond the request body. Now what I mean by that is on our front end, right? Our front end knows that we're logged in as a given user. Okay, so I'm going to just draw a computer here, and it knows that we're logged in as a certain user with a certain ID, right? We'll just say ABC as the ID here. But our server, right? When our server receives a request from somebody saying, hey, I'm user ABC, it really has no idea whether that's true or not. Right? And one of the things we're going to want to do here is make sure that users can only access their own data. So in other words, if user ABC tries to request user 123's data by making a request to something like users/123, we want the server to be able to recognize that that's not the user who made the request and deny access to that resource. Now, the way that we do this is where Firebase Auth comes in. The way that we do that is by having the front end include the user's auth token, right? An auth token is a long string generally that we can use to actually verify that the user is who they say they are. We're not going to go too much into the details of how this works right now, but just know that that's its main purpose. So including this auth token in the headers of all the requests that we send to the server is going to be the main point of interest that we'll see as we actually add that network logic here. And later on, we'll see how to actually make our server parse this auth token and make sure that it's valid. So what we're going to do is we're going to basically open up each of the pages where we need to either load data or make some other kind of server request and see how to add that in. So let's start off with our home page here. Since in our home page, we basically just want to load the user info from the server so that we can display it down here in the JSX. So first of all, loading the data from the server is going to be something that we need the use effect hook to do. And what that's going to look like, chances are you've seen something like this before, is we're just going to say use effect. And inside here, we're going to make a network request. Now, you can use the fetch API, which is just the default way of making network requests from the front end, but I usually prefer to use a library called Axios. So what I'm going to do for that is just say npm install Axios and make sure you're running this in the front end if you want to follow along with it. And once that's installed, we can actually import and use it. So let's say import Axios from Axios. And down here now, we're going to make a network request to our server by saying, first of all, we need to define an asynchronous function here. So we'll say const load user info equals async. And then we're going to make our request by saying const response equals await Axios.get, right? This is a get request endpoint. And we're going to get users / and we need the user's ID here. So first of all, we're going to want to convert these to backticks. And then in order to insert the user's ID, all we need to do is say user.id, right, on this user that we're getting from our use user custom hook. So we'll just say user dot, and then the property for that is UID. Okay, so if all goes well here, that will send us back the user's information. So we can just say set user info response.data, and we should be good. Now we need to actually call this function. So we'll say if user load user info, right? We only want to actually load this information if the user exists. Otherwise, this will be users / undefined. And we also need to add a dependency to our use effect hook, which will be user. All right, so that's the basic loading logic, but we still haven't added in the auth token stuff that I talked about before. Basically, in order to get a user's auth token, there's just a special method that we need to call on this user object here that will basically give us the auth token we're looking for. So what that's going to look like, it's actually quite straightforward. We just need to say const token equals await user.getID token. And yes, this is an asynchronous thing here. It needs to actually generate that ID token for us. And now that we have this token, all we have to do is pass that as the headers of our request. So the way that we specify headers on an axios.get request is we pass an object as the second argument, and we give that object a property called headers. And we want to set an auth token header. So we'll say auth token. All right, and there are other ways to include the auth token in the request, but this is the one that I see used quite often. All right, and that's all we should need to do for our data loading here. So let's actually try out our home page. You're going to want to make sure that both the front end and back end are running. So we'll say npm run start for our front end, and our back end's already running here. Oh, and one last thing that we're going to need to do is actually set a proxy on our front end so that it will think that it and the back end are running on the same port. So we'll say package.json. We're going to specify a proxy property here, and this will just be the URL of our locally running server. So we'll say http://localhost 8080, and that's it. Okay, and you will need to restart your front end in order for that to take effect. So sorry about that. Okay, and what we'll see is that once our homepage loads, we now see that we are displaying the correct information for our user, right? We have your name is Sean Wassell, your bio is I like to program. Perfect, that's exactly what we wanted, and it looks like everything's going well here so far. Okay, and just one thing to note is that we're not actually using this auth token here yet. We're just putting that there so that when we actually want to add a little bit more security to our server, we can do so relatively easily. Okay, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to open up our create account page. And this one's going to be a little different because when we create an account, right, when a user inputs their email, password, bio, name, etc., in addition to actually creating the account using the Firebase function that we saw earlier, we also want to send a request to that create server endpoint with the user's information that they entered. So in order to make that change, we're actually going to have to open up our use auth custom hook here. So we'll say use auth. And we're going to want to scroll down to create account. Now, create account, this is where we basically create the user with their email and password. And that will actually return, right? This function will actually return the user that we've created, which will, we'll be able to use their ID for that. So what we're going to do is say const result equals await create user with email and password. And once we have that result, we're going to say const token equals result.user.getID token. And once we have that, we're going to make a post request to the server to create a new user. So we'll say const response equals await axios.post. Okay, the URL we're going to be sending this to is just /users, right? It doesn't have the ID in the URL. And for the request body, what we're going to do is basically include both the user ID, right? That's going to be the ID on this user we created here. So for that, we can just say ID result.user.uid. And underneath that, we're going to include the user's info, right? Which is just going to be the name and bio. So let's add those as arguments here, as I said we should remember earlier. And then we're going to say user info, and we're going to pass the name and bio through as arguments there. Okay, and additionally, we're also going to include the auth token header. So we'll just say headers and auth token, and for that, we're going to pass the user's token. Okay, and we're not actually going to do anything with this response here, so we can just remove this, I suppose. There we go. And that should be all we need to do for creating an account. So remember that here, right, essentially what we're doing here requires two different parties, right? There's two different third parties involved. There is Firebase Auth, right? I'm just going to call that FBA. And there's also our own server, right? I'll say ours. And our front end basically is communicating with both. So it's first of all creating a new user in Firebase Auth. Firebase Auth is sending back the new information for that user, such as the ID, and then our front end is actually sending that information to the server. Now, in general, this kind of flow isn't necessarily the best way to do things because it's relying on the client side to basically keep both Firebase Auth and our server in sync. So what we would normally want to do is have something more like this, where our client side simply sends a request to our server to create a new account, and our server actually takes care of communicating with Firebase Auth, right? So I'll just name that there. There should be a separation line there, and this would be our server here. Okay, now that is more complicated to do, which is why we're not doing it here right now, but just keep in mind that what we're going to be doing here isn't necessarily the most foolproof way to do things. There's just a few difficulties that can come up if we leave it this way. Okay, so we've seen how to load data from our server with including the ID token, right, the auth token, and we've seen how to post data to our server with that ID token as well. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to basically convert some of these other functions here. We don't need login and we don't need log out. So what we're going to do here is open up our edit account page, and we're going to add some logic for saving the changes. So this is basically just going to make a put request to our server. So all we're going to do here is say const save changes, we'll call it, equals async. And this is going to use Axios again, so we'll say const response equals Axios. Oops, we need to do await Axios dot put. The URL here is going to involve the user's ID. So first of all, we'll need to actually get the user using our custom hook. So we'll say import use user from ... hooks / use user. And we'll say const user, oops, that needs to be in curly braces there, equals use user. All right, and all we have to do here now is basically we'll say axios.put /users /user.uid. The request body for this is going to include the user's updates, so we'll say updates and include the name and bio along with that. And we're also going to include the user's auth token as we have with the other ones. So for that, I'm just going to indent this stuff to make it a little more readable. There we go. For the headers, we're just going to say headers. And we'll say auth token. And then, of course, we need to get the tokens. So we'll say const token equals user.getID token. And that is asynchronous, so we'll need to say await user.getID token. Okay, so now we just need to pass this. And essentially, once this response is done, right, once we've gotten the updated user, we're just going to redirect the user back to the home page. So in order to do that, we're just going to import our use history hook from React Router DOM so that we can navigate programmatically. We've seen this before, so don't worry about it if you haven't used this before. So we're just going to say const history equals use history. And then to navigate the user back to the home page after this, after the changes are saved, we're going to say history.push and send them back to the home page. Okay, so now down here, we're just going to make our save changes button actually call that function. So we'll say onClick equals save changes. And one other thing that we have to do is we actually have to load the initial data for this user before we allow them to edit it, right? We need to actually pre-populate these fields, right? These input fields with the user's current information. Now to do that, for now, I'm just going to copy and paste the logic directly from the home page because that's almost the exact same logic that we need. So I'm just going to copy and paste the user info state and the use effect hook into edit account page. We'll see how to actually encapsulate this a little later on, but for now, it's just easiest to do this. And the only change we need to make inside this use effect hook now is we need to make sure we set the name and bio values once we've loaded this data. So actually, we don't even need user info. We're just going to say set name to response.data.name and set bio to response.data.bio. All right, so let's give this page a try here. Oops, we need to actually import Axios and use effect here. Forgot to do that. We're going to say use effect from React. And we're going to also import Axios by saying import Axios from Axios. Okay, and we have to do the same thing in use auth. We're just going to say up here at the top, import Axios from Axios. All right, that got rid of all of our errors, so let's go check our edit account page and see if that's successfully loading all of our data. So we're going to go to edit my account, and sure enough, we see that Sean Wassell and I like to program are both inside of there. Let's test the actual edit functionality here by saying I like to program a lot. And if we click Save Changes, we should see that that navigates us back to the home page now with the updated data. Okay, so the last thing we're going to have to implement here is the delete my account button. This one is going to make a request to the delete endpoint that we created earlier. So for that, we just need to open up our home page and add a little bit of logic here that will be hooked up to this delete my account button. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say const delete account. It's going to be async and it's going to use Axios to make a delete request. So we'll say well, first of all, we're going to need to get the user's auth token. So we'll say const token equals await user.getID token. There we go. And then we're going to say const response equals await axios.delete. Okay, and the URL here is going to be /users/ and then we're going to insert the user's ID as we've seen. So user.uid. And we don't need a request body here, but we do need the same headers as before, so we'll just say headers, auth token, token. Okay, and that is our response. So all we have to do after that really is just log the user out, right? After they've deleted their account, we're going to want to log them out. So what we'll do for that is we're just going to get our logout. Well, actually, we already have logout from useauth, so that's convenient. We're just going to say await log out, and we should be good. Okay, and we actually don't even need this response, so we'll just say await axios.delete. And now we just need to make our delete button call that delete account function by saying onClick equals delete account. And that should be all we need to do. So in order to test this thing, I'm actually not going to test it with this account because I want to keep using this account for examples later on. So what we're going to do is log out and test out creating an account, right? Remember that this is something that we haven't tested yet either. So for the email, what I'm going to do is say Sean, I believe I'm on Sean 8 now, and here instead of test.com, we'll say gmail.com. For the password, just going to use the same one that I've used before. We'll re-enter it. And for the full name, I'm going to say Sean Wassell, short bio, I like food, and let's click create account and see if the create account flow works. So I'm going to click on that, and sure enough, we should see that that takes us to the home page and that our data has been successfully filled in by the server. All right. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to test deleting our account by clicking on delete my account. And sure enough, that's logged us out. Now, if we want to actually test to see if the user's been deleted from the database, all we have to do is send a request to try and load that user. So let me just open up server.js. We're just going to send a request to this with that user's ID. And we can get that user's ID, by the way, by going into Firebase Auth. There we go. We might have to refresh it to find your new user. There we go, Sean 8. I'm going to copy the user ID. And I'm going to go to localhost 8080 /users/ and then I'm going to paste that UID. And we should see not found because it was deleted from the database. So that's what we are expecting to see. Anyway, it looks like all of our server endpoints are working correctly, and it looks like all of our, all of the corresponding bindings on the front end are working as well. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.